On February 9th, 1953, a maintenance worker at the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas discovered something that would remain sealed in a private vault for 68 years. Behind a false panel in what had been the presidential suite, he found a leather-bound ledger with brass corners and a lock that had rusted shut. When hotel security finally pried it open, they found pages of meticulous handwriting in fountain pen ink, each entry dated, each one signed with a single initial. V. The entries detailed a breeding program. 4 daughters, 1 man, a widow's plan to preserve what she called the bloodline of power. The final entry, dated December 24, 1952, read simply, "The contract is fulfilled. We are bound by blood and silence. May God forgive what the family required." This is not a story about a crime family's descent into depravity. This is a story about a woman who believed that power was genetic, that loyalty could be engineered, and that the survival of an empire justified the sacrifice of everything ordinary people call sacred. This is the story of Vivian Castellano, the widow who turned motherhood into a strategic operation, and the bodyguard who became the biological father of an entire generation while remaining a ghost in their lives. Before we continue, I need you to understand something about the world we're entering. This happened. The ledger exists. The daughters lived into old age, and 3 of them took the secret to their graves. The 4th spoke once to a reporter in 2019, 2 weeks before she died. She said, "My mother didn't see us as daughters. She saw us as vessels, and she saw him as the strongest seed she could plant." Then she refused to say another word. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? Because this story asks a question that geography can't answer. What happens when a woman decides that love is a luxury and genetics are a weapon? To understand how Vivian Castellano came to orchestrate what investigators would later call the most coldly calculated eugenic experiment in organized crime history, we must go back to a winter night in 1947, to a hospital room in Brooklyn where her husband, Sal, the architect Castellano, died with a bullet in his lung and her hand in his. Sal had built an empire. He didn't run the docks or the numbers. He ran the money. He was the man who turned cash into real estate into political leverage, and political leverage into untouchable power. He owned judges. He owned precincts. He owned, by the time he died at 42, a network that stretched from the Brooklyn waterfront to the new casinos rising in the Nevada desert. And he owned Vivian, or so everyone thought. They had married in 1929, when she was 17 and he was 24. She was the daughter of a Sicilian olive oil importer who'd gone legitimate after Prohibition. Beautiful, educated at a convent school, fluent in 3 languages, trained in bookkeeping by nuns who believed women should be able to manage a household's finances. Sal saw her at a wedding and told his father, "That one, she thinks." 3 months later, they were married in a cathedral with 2,000 guests and a cardinal who'd been paid to ignore certain questions about the groom's associations. Vivian gave him 4 daughters in 6 years, Francesca in 1930, Lucia in 1932, Maria in 1934, Antonella in 1936. No sons. In a world where sons were currency and daughters were liabilities to be married off. This was a problem. Sal never said it was her fault. He never had to. His father said it. His brothers said it. The men who came to the house for meetings said it with their eyes when they looked past the girls like they were furniture. But Sal loved his daughters in his way. He had them tutored. He brought them to the office and let them watch him work. He told Vivian, "They're smarter than half the men I employ. If they were boys, I'd be building a dynasty." Vivian heard what he didn't say. Because they're not, you've failed me. When Sal was shot, a territorial dispute that went wrong, a meeting that was supposed to be neutral ground, a young soldier who panicked and fired before anyone could stop him. Vivian sat beside his hospital bed for 16 hours while he drowned in his own blood. The doctors said he spoke to her in the final minutes. No one knows what he said. But when she walked out of that room, witnesses later told investigators her face looked like stone. The funeral was attended by everyone who mattered. The commission sent flowers. Judges sent condolences. The mayor of New York sent a wreath. Vivian wore black and stood beside the casket with her 4 daughters arranged by height, and she didn't cry. She shook hands. She accepted embraces. She thanked people for coming. And when Sal's younger brother Enzo approached her after the burial and said, "We'll take care of you, Viv. The family takes care of its own," she looked at him with eyes that one witness described as empty and full at the same time and said, "I'll take care of myself." What followed was a 6-month war of attrition. Enzo wanted control of Sal's operations. He had the backing of 2 of the 5 families. He had soldiers. He had the assumption that a widow, even a smart one, would fold. He didn't have Vivian's ledgers. He didn't have the keys to the safe deposit boxes. He didn't have the coded records of every transaction, every property, every politician on the payroll. Vivian had spent 18 years watching her husband build an empire, and she had kept a parallel set of books. Not because she didn't trust him, because she was curious, because she liked to know how things worked. She called a meeting. She invited Enzo and the captains who'd assumed they'd be carving up Sal's territory. She sat at the head of the table in the back room of a restaurant in Little Italy, and she laid out a single ledger. She said, "This is one of 12. They contain every transaction Sal made in the last decade. Every name, every amount, every favor owed, and every secret buried. If anything happens to me, all 12 go to the FBI, the IRS, and the New York Times. If you try to push me out, the same thing happens. But if you work with me, we all get rich, and no one goes to prison." Enzo stared at her. One of the captains started to laugh, then stopped when he saw her face. She wasn't bluffing. She had turned her husband's empire into a dead man's switch, and she was holding the trigger. They worked with her. They didn't like it. They resented it. But they worked with her because the alternative was annihilation. And for 2 years, it functioned. Vivian ran the money. She expanded into Las Vegas, buying points in 3 casinos. She cultivated relationships with the new generation of mobsters moving west. She was brilliant. She was ruthless. And she was terrified, though she never let anyone see it. Because she knew the truth that Enzo and the others were too proud to say out loud. Her power was temporary. She was a woman in a world built by men for men. Her daughters were teenagers, beautiful and smart, but they were still daughters. The moment she died, or the moment she showed weakness, the empire would be carved up and her family would be reduced to footnotes. Widows and orphans, charity cases, she needed sons, or she needed something close enough to sons that the family would accept them as heirs, and she needed them to be hers, genetically and legally, in a way that no one could dispute. This is where the story turns. This is where Vivian Castellano stopped being a widow defending her husband's legacy and became something else entirely. An architect of bloodlines, a woman who looked at her 4 daughters and saw not failures, but raw material. In the summer of 1949, Vivian promoted a man named Thomas Kyle to head of her personal security detail. Kyle was 31. He'd been a Marine, deployed in the Pacific, decorated for valor at Iwo Jima. After the war, he drifted into private security work, and Sal had hired him in 1946 as a driver. Kyle was 6'3", 220 pounds of muscle, with a face that looked like it had been carved with a hatchet. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He didn't talk unless he had something to say. Sal had trusted him because Kyle was the kind of man who would step in front of a bullet without hesitation and never ask for a raise. Vivian trusted him for different reasons. She had watched him for 2 years. She had tested him in small ways, asking him to deliver sealed envelopes, to handle cash, to be present during sensitive meetings, and he had never once betrayed a confidence or shown curiosity about things that weren't his business. He was loyal, he was disciplined, and crucially, he had no family, no wife, no children, no entanglements that would complicate what she was about to propose. She called him into her office at the Flamingo on a Tuesday afternoon in August. The office was on the top floor, overlooking the desert and the neon sprawl of the Strip. She sat behind a mahogany desk that had belonged to Bugsy Siegel. Kyle stood in front of the desk with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. Vivian said, "I'm going to ask you to do something that will sound insane. I need you to listen to the entire proposal before you respond. If you say no, you'll walk out of here with $50,000 in cash and a reference that will get you any job in the country. If you say yes, you'll be bound to me and my family for the rest of your life, and you'll be compensated in ways that will make you a wealthy man. Do you understand?" Kyle nodded once. Vivian opened a folder and slid a photograph across the desk. It showed her 4 daughters standing in a row, dressed for church. Francesca was 19, Lucia was 17, Maria was 15, Antonella was 13. Vivian said, "I need sons. The family needs heirs. My daughters are intelligent, capable, and loyal, but they're women. And this world doesn't care about capable women. It cares about men. Specifically, it cares about sons who carry the bloodline. I can't produce sons, but my daughters can." She paused. Kyle's expression didn't change. Vivian continued, "I've spent 2 years analyzing genetics, reading everything I can find about heredity, about what makes men strong. I've consulted with doctors, discreetly. I've studied bloodlines the way my husband studied balance sheets. And I've concluded that the traits I need, physical strength, intelligence, loyalty, discipline, are heritable. I need those traits in the next generation. I need them in boys who will grow into men who can hold what we've built." She slid another photograph across the desk. This one showed Kyle in his Marine uniform, standing at attention, medals on his chest. "You," Vivian said, "are the strongest, most disciplined man I've ever met. You're intelligent. You're loyal. You have no genetic diseases, no history of mental illness, no addictions. You're perfect. And I want you to father children with each of my daughters." The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, the desert sun beat down on the Strip. Inside, the air conditioning hummed. Kyle said, his voice flat, "You want me to impregnate your daughters?" "Yes. All 4 of them." "Yes. And then what?" Vivian leaned forward. "And then you disappear from their lives. You'll be their bodyguard. You'll be present, but distant. The children will be raised as Castellanos. They'll never know you're their biological father. Publicly, each daughter will have married a suitable man. Men I'll select. Men who will agree to the arrangement for financial compensation and status. But genetically, the children will be yours and theirs. The bloodline will be preserved. The family will have heirs, and you will be taken care of for the rest of your life. Kyle stared at the photographs. He said, "What if they say no?" Vivian's face was unreadable. "They won't. You've already talked to them. I've prepared them. They understand what's required." Kyle was silent for a long time. Then he said, "What's the timeline?" Vivian pulled out the ledger, the same ledger that would be found 4 years later behind the false panel. She opened it to the first page, where she'd written out a schedule in her precise convent school handwriting. "Francesca first," Vivian said. "She's the oldest. She'll set the example. You'll begin in September. The process will be clinical. I've consulted with a doctor who specializes in fertility. You'll meet with each daughter during her most fertile window, 3 times per cycle, to maximize the chance of conception. Once she's confirmed pregnant, you'll move to the next daughter. The goal is to have all 4 pregnant within 18 months. Kyle said, "And if I say no?" Vivian closed the ledger. "Then you take the money and you leave, and I find someone else. But I chose you because I trust you. And because I think, on some level, you understand what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to build something that lasts. I'm trying to turn my daughters into mothers of kings." Kyle looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I want it in writing, the terms, the compensation, the guarantees." Vivian smiled for the first time. "I already have the contract prepared." She pulled out a second folder. Inside was a 10-page document, typed on legal paper, witnessed by a lawyer whose name had been redacted in the version investigators would later find. The contract stipulated that Thomas Cale would father children with Francesca, Lucia, Maria, and Antonella Castellano. He would receive a one-time payment of $100,000 upon the birth of the first child, and an additional $50,000 for each subsequent child. He would be given a property in Montana, fully paid, in a name that couldn't be traced to the Castellano family. He would receive a monthly stipend of $5,000 for the rest of his life. In exchange, he would never publicly acknowledge paternity. He would never contact the children. He would remain in Vivian's employ as head of security, and he would take the secret to his grave. Kyle read the contract twice. Then he signed it. Vivian signed below him. She slid the contract into the folder and locked it in the desk. She said, "We begin in 2 weeks. I'll make the arrangements." Kyle stood. He said, "Does this make me a monster?" Vivian looked at him with those empty, full eyes. "It makes you a tool. Whether you're a monster depends on what you do with the life I'm giving you afterward." Kyle walked out. Vivian sat alone in the office as the sun set over the desert, turning the sky the color of blood and gold. The first encounter happened on September 12th, 1949, in a suite at the Flamingo that Vivian had converted into what she called the medical room. It had a bed, a private bathroom, and a small desk with a lamp. The walls were painted a neutral beige. There were no windows. Vivian had hired a nurse, a woman named Margaret Holt, who'd worked in a fertility clinic in Los Angeles and who was paid enough to ensure her silence. Francesca arrived at 8 in the evening. She wore a simple dress and no jewelry. Kyle was already there, standing by the window, still in his suit. Margaret Holt waited by the door. Vivian had prepared her daughters. She'd explained the plan in clinical terms. She'd framed it as a duty, a sacrifice for the family, a way to ensure their futures and the futures of their children. She'd told them that the men they would eventually marry would be chosen carefully, that they would be partners in name only, that the children they bore would be Castellanos first and foremost. She'd told them that Thomas Kyle was the best possible genetic match, that he was strong and intelligent and loyal, and that this was not about love or desire. This was about survival. Francesca had listened. She was 19, old enough to understand what her mother was asking, old enough to see the logic even as every instinct recoiled. She'd asked one question: what if I can't do it? Vivian had said, then the family dies with me, and you spend the rest of your life as a footnote in someone else's story. Francesca had nodded. She'd understood. Now, in the medical room, she stood across from Cale. Margaret Holt said, her voice gentle, I'll be in the next room. If you need anything, just call. She left, closing the door behind her. Francesca and Kyle looked at each other. He said, I'm sorry, she said. Don't be. This isn't your fault. It's not yours either. I know. She took a breath. Let's just get it over with. What happened in that room, and in the rooms that followed over the next 18 months, was recorded only in Vivian's ledger. She noted dates. She noted outcomes. She noted when each daughter conceived, when each pregnancy was confirmed, when each child was born. She wrote in the margins small observations. F cried afterward, composed by morning. L asked if it would hurt less the second time. I told her yes. M requested music. I allowed it. A didn't speak for 3 days after, resumed normal behavior on the 4th. Francesca conceived on the 2nd cycle. She gave birth to a son, Vincent, on June 3rd, 1950. Vivian held the baby in the hospital and wept, the only time anyone ever saw her cry after Sal's death. Lucia conceived on the 1st cycle. She gave birth to a son, Michael, on November 18, 1950. Maria took 4 cycles. She gave birth to a son, Dominic, on August 22, 1951. Antonella, the youngest, conceived on the 3rd cycle. She gave birth to a daughter, Gabriella, on April 9, 1952. Vivian had wanted a son, but she accepted the daughter with the same clinical satisfaction she'd shown for the boys. 4 children, she wrote in the ledger. 3 sons. The bloodline is secure. By December 1952, all 4 daughters had been quietly married to men Vivian had selected. These men were ambitious, presentable, and willing to accept the terms. They would raise the children as their own. They would never question paternity, and they would be compensated with positions in the family business and financial security. They signed contracts. They played their roles. And the children grew up believing that their fathers were the men who sat at the dinner table, not the silent bodyguard who stood by the door during family gatherings. Thomas Kyle remained head of security. He watched the children grow from a distance. He never held them. He never spoke to them beyond polite greetings. Vivian paid him as promised. In 1955, he moved to Montana, to the property she'd bought him, a ranch with 100 acres and a view of the mountains. He raised horses. He lived alone. He never married. He died in 1987 at the age of 69, of a heart attack while mending a fence. His will left everything to a veterans' charity. There was no mention of the Castellano family, no mention of the children, no photographs, nothing. Vivian lived until 1979. She ran the family operations until she was 70, then handed control to Vincent, Francesca's son, who'd grown into a man with his grandfather's mind for money and his biological father's physical presence. Vincent never knew. None of the children knew, not while Vivian was alive. The ledger remained hidden until 2021, when the Flamingo was undergoing renovations and the false panel was discovered. By then, Francesca, Lucia, and Maria were dead. Antonella was 85, living in a care facility in Arizona. A reporter tracked her down, showed her a photocopy of the ledger, and asked if it was true. Antonella looked at the pages for a long time. Then she said, "My mother didn't see us as daughters. She saw us as vessels, and she saw him as the strongest seed she could plant." She refused to say anything else. 2 weeks later, she died in her sleep. The children, Vincent, Michael, Dominic, and Gabriella, were contacted by investigators. DNA tests were offered. Vincent refused. Michael refused. Dominic agreed, and the test confirmed what the ledger claimed. Thomas Cale was his biological father. Dominic released a statement. "I am a Castellano. I was raised by a man I called father, and I loved him. Genetics don't change that. This information changes nothing about who I am or who my family is." Gabriella, the only daughter, agreed to an interview. She was 70 at the time, a retired school teacher living in Oregon. She said, "I always wondered why my grandmother looked at me the way she did, like I was a project, like I was proof of something. Now I know, she was playing God, and the worst part is, it worked. We all turned out exactly the way she wanted. Successful, loyal, strong. We're her legacy, and I don't know if that makes me proud or sick." The case was never prosecuted. Everyone involved was dead. The children were adults with families of their own. The contracts, the ledger, the medical records, all of it was legally ambiguous. Was it coercion? Was it conspiracy? Was it a crime at all? Or just a grotesque exercise of power within a family that operated by its own rules? The FBI opened a file, then closed it. The Nevada Gaming Commission reviewed the Castellano family's casino holdings, found nothing actionable, and moved on. The story made headlines for a week, then faded. The ledger was placed in a private collection, sealed for 50 years. But the question remains. Not the legal question, not the moral question, though that one haunts anyone who reads the ledger's meticulous entries. The question is this: what kind of love drives a mother to turn her daughters into broodmares? What kind of fear makes a woman believe that blood is the only currency that matters? And what kind of world creates a Vivian Castellano in the first place? A woman so convinced that power is genetic, that loyalty can be engineered, that she would sacrifice everything ordinary people call sacred to build a dynasty that would outlast her. Vivian Castellano died believing she had won. She had sons, or close enough. She had heirs. The family survived. The empire she and Sal built continued, evolved, eventually went legitimate. Vincent became a real estate developer. Michael ran a chain of hotels. Dominic went into politics, served 2 terms in the Nevada State Senate. Gabriella taught elementary school for 40 years and never spoke publicly about her family until the ledger was found. They were successful. They were strong. They were exactly what Vivian had engineered them to be. But they were also human. And humans are not projects. They are not tools. They are not seeds to be planted in the most fertile soil a woman can find. In the end, Vivian Castellano's legacy is not the empire. It's the question she forced her daughters to answer every day of their lives. Can you love someone who sees you as a means to an end? Can you forgive a mother who turned your body into a battlefield in a war you didn't choose? And if you can't forgive, if you can't love, what does that make you? Francesca never spoke about it. She raised Vincent, loved her husband in the quiet way people love partners they didn't choose but learned to respect, and died of cancer at 62. Her last words, according to her daughter-in-law, were, "Tell Vincent his grandmother loved him. Tell him she did what she thought she had to do." Lucia drank. She was functional, always composed in public, but those close to her knew. She died of liver failure at 58. She left a note that said only, "I did my duty. I hope it was enough." Maria became a painter. She never sold her work, never showed it publicly. After she died, her children found a studio full of canvases, all of them depicting the same image: a woman standing in a desert, facing away from the viewer, her shadow stretching toward a horizon that never came. Antonella, the youngest, outlived them all. She married a kind man, a teacher, and they had 3 children together. She never told him about the ledger, about Kyle, about what her mother had done. When the reporter showed her the evidence, she said, "I spent my whole life trying to be more than what she made me, and I don't know if I succeeded." Thomas Kyle left no record of his thoughts, no journal, no letters. The only thing investigators found in his Montana ranch was a single photograph, tucked into a Bible in his bedside table. It showed 4 children, standing in a row, dressed for a family portrait. On the back, in handwriting that wasn't his, someone had written, "The Future, 1955. The photograph had been taken by Vivian. She'd sent it to him, a single gesture in 37 years of silence. He'd kept it. He'd never responded. And when he died, alone on his ranch with the mountains watching, the photograph was still there, a relic of a contract fulfilled and a life spent in service to a woman's vision of genetic destiny. Maybe Vivian was a monster. Maybe she was a pragmatist. Maybe she was a woman who looked at the world as it was, a world that valued sons over daughters, bloodlines over love, power over everything, and decided to play by those rules better than anyone else. Or maybe she was something worse. Maybe she was a true believer, a woman who convinced herself that what she was doing was noble, necessary, even loving, that by turning her daughters into vessels and a loyal soldier into a stud, she was securing their futures, protecting them from the fate of widows and orphans in a world that devoured the weak. The human capacity for self-deception is nearly infinite. We can convince ourselves that cruelty is kindness, that control is love, that the ends justify any means if the ends are survival. Vivian Castellano built a dynasty. She preserved a bloodline. She turned 4 daughters into mothers and 1 bodyguard into a ghost. And she did it all with the meticulous precision of a woman who believed that if she could just control enough variables, engineer enough outcomes, she could defeat the chaos of a world that had taken her husband and threatened to take everything else. But you can't engineer love. You can't control loyalty. You can't turn human beings into tools without breaking something essential in them and in yourself. The children survived. They thrived by most measures. But survival is not the same as wholeness, and legacy is not the same as love. In the end, the question is not whether Vivian Castellano succeeded. The question is whether the cost of her success, 4 daughters who spent their lives wondering if they were loved or used, 1 man who became a father to children he could never claim, and a generation raised on a foundation of secrets and genetic calculation, was worth the empire she preserved. The ledger offers no answer. It only records the dates, the outcomes, the clinical details of a plan executed with ruthless efficiency. The final entry, written on Christmas Eve 1952, after Antonella had given birth and the contracts were fulfilled, reads, "The contract is fulfilled. We are bound by blood and silence. May God forgive what the family required. May God forgive, not what I required, what the family required." Even in her private ledger, Vivian Castellano framed her choices as duty, as necessity, as something larger than herself. But God, if He exists, doesn't answer questions about forgiveness in ledgers. He answers them in the lives of the people who survived the choices of the powerful. And those lives, the lives of Francesca and Lucia and Maria and Antonella, of Vincent and Michael and Dominic and Gabriella, of Thomas Cale alone on his ranch. Those lives are the only testimony that matters. They lived. They carried the weight of what Vivian had done. Some of them forgave her. Some of them didn't. Some of them never knew enough to choose. And the truth, like the woman who engineered it all, remains locked behind a question that has no answer. Can you build a legacy on blood and silence and call it love? Can you turn your children into instruments of your will and still claim you did it for them? And if you can, if you succeed, if the dynasty survives and the bloodline continues, what, in the end, have you actually preserved? The ledger is sealed now, locked away for 50 years. The children are old or dead. The empire has evolved into something Vivian might not even recognize. Legitimate businesses, charitable foundations, grandchildren who've never heard the name Thomas Cale. But the question remains. It will remain long after the last Castellano dies, long after the ledger crumbles to dust. Because Vivian Castellano's story is not unique. It's just the most meticulously documented version of a choice that people in power have made throughout history. The choice to treat human beings as resources, to engineer outcomes, to sacrifice the individual for the survival of the whole. And every time that choice is made, the same question echoes. Was it worth it? Not in terms of success or failure, wealth or ruin, survival or extinction, but in terms of the human cost. The daughters who became vessels, the man who became a ghost, the children who grew up not knowing that their entire existence was the result of a contract signed in a Las Vegas hotel room by a widow who believed that blood was destiny. Maybe some stories aren't meant to have endings. Maybe some questions aren't meant to be answered. Maybe the point is just to sit with the discomfort, to look at what Vivian Castellano did and ask yourself, what would I have done? What would I sacrifice to preserve what I love? And at what point does preservation become destruction? The ledger is silent. The graves are quiet. The children, those who remain, have said all they're willing to say. But the question lives on, and it will keep living, as long as there are people who believe that power is genetic, that loyalty can be engineered, and that the survival of a legacy justifies the sacrifice of everything we call sacred. Vivian Castellano died believing she had won. History will decide if she was right.